Good morning, everyone. Today we are in the presence of Mr. Cody. Thank you, Ms. Christina, for sending me his picture, and that's going to be our background for today. I'll hand it to you ever since I implicitly complained that I have to be the one that taking care of the background pictures. I actually have a queue of pictures waiting. So if you send me an email with a picture that you think that should be at the background of those lectures, don't worry, we'll get there. It's just going to be a couple of more days. So thanks for that. Let's start. All right. Today we'll complete the discussion about the economic aspect of international relations, mostly talk about different economic policies. As always, we'll begin with a quick review of Tuesday's topics. So it includes mostly the introduction of international political economy based on the role that the government plays in the global economy, the different aspects that government has to ensure that are operating properly in order to ensure global flow of finances is good, which overall provides better benefits to the members of the system. So us, the public, contributes for that. We started a little bit talking about free trade and the basic economic principles behind free trade, comparative advantage, why it's better for the United States to produce wheat compared to France that produces wine, as an example. We talked about the multiple benefits of trade to those who are part of the system, to the public, to the government, to the producers, all those things. And then we also spend a lot of time talking about different costs of global trade, mostly the distributional consequences, the fact that global trade provides a lot of benefits, but they're not always shared equally among all members of the population. And that leads to a lot of grievances and problems. I talked about the study by Lee and Ruveni about whether democracy also actually provides different mechanisms that whether trade actually offers support for democracies or not. We talked about different mechanisms in which trade supports democracy, or different mechanism in which trade actually harms democracies. And the bottom line was that trade offers a lot of benefits. In the short term, it offers actually a lot of costs. And the main challenge, reminding you everything that we went back eventually to the short video clip from the West Wing TV show, was the need to design those socio-economic global policies which will allow us still to gain from the benefits of trade but alleviating some of those costs. And then I talked about the Mansfield and Mutz paper, which addresses more directly how the public views the idea of free trade and the benefits of trade. And what they showed pretty clearly is that some of those economic models are missing the point a little bit, because the public uses mostly what's called sociotropic preferences. We care about the economy as a whole, not my own personal benefits when I give you my opinion about a free trade or global trade policy. So that's the idea behind that. And actually sociotropic preferences have also been prevalent if you're interested in studies that address the public opinion about immigration policies and all others related issues. So if you have any questions, of course, about those issues, you're more than welcome to come talk to me on office hours or email me, and let's move on. So on Tuesday, as I said, I just finished talking about, we talked about the foundations of the political economy, the benefits as well as the cost of free trade, incentives for the government to pursue trade, and how the public views that. Now I want to shift gears and focus on the policy part of this topic and discuss two of the main tools of what can be viewed as the economic statecraft, which are sanctions and foreign aid. So let's start with sanctions. Sanctions are a coercive policy which is intended to compel the target, a target that that accepts those that gets those sanctions, to change its behavior. The success and failures of sanctions are based on the decision by those members of that interaction. So sanctions can end when the target gives in and change its behavior, change its policy, or they can fail when the sender, the country that imposed the sanctions, decides to remove them. And that's going to be our focus, what are the different factors that affect the success and failure of economic policy. We're focusing, of course, mostly on economic sanctions, which are a set of policy actions that apply economic pressure on a target by limited its ability to engage in regular economic activity and is intended to induce a change in the behavior. The origins of the economic sanctions policy is the warfare tactic of a siege, in which the attacker hoped that by closing off a city, a walled city, to such a high level and put such pressure on the citizens that's going to lead them to actually to starve them into submission. The fact that they will be walled off and they will be closed in that city for so long, they're eventually going to starve and they're going to accept the demand of the attacker. It has been prevalent since the establishment of the League of Nations, one of the first international institutions after the First World War. And it has become a lot more, even more prevalent, and it has a substantial rise in its use since the end of the Cold War. For example, these are the different US sanction programs around the world in the middle of 2019. So as you can see, we have here sanctions that are imposed on countries in Central America, it's Cuba, and Nicaragua here in South America, African countries, the Middle East, of course, is part of it, and our friends from Russia. Okay. The logic behind economic sanctions is that it is intended to create an economic deprivation that limits how much the public is willing to withstand those costs. So there's severe economic costs on the public, and the sanctions are intended to push that even further until at some point a threshold is reached. So there's a limit to how much the public is willing to accept those kinds of costs, and then it's going to put pressure, which is going to lead to political disintegration. A similar example in the setting of a conflict is aerial bombing strategy, right? So one country is pursuing in continuous aerial bombing strategy over another and putting a lot of pressure on the civilian population of the target country in order to push that civilian population to put pressure on the government to change its behavior. Everything that the Germans did against the British in the Second World War leads to that. Constant aerial bombing of England in the first half of the war in order to put the pressure on the Brits to change their behavior. The mechanism is relatively simple. It is imposing economic cost on the population of the target states, which in turn has to put political pressure on the government to alter its behavior. But this is the important part here. The economic cost that the sanctions are creating has to lead or has to be translated to political ones. Otherwise, any change is unlikely. It's also important that the target government will be vulnerable to economic coercion. But unless the economic costs are being translated to any kind of political implications, then any change is very unlikely to happen. As an example for a high level of economic cost, this was the expected economic cost from sanctions on Russia following the Russians' attack in Ukraine, the behavior that the Russians have invaded and took control of the Crimea Peninsula in Ukraine a couple of years ago. So this is the extent of cost, economic cost for Russia from sanctions on its trade with the United States, but mostly the European Union. You can see the numbers here are very, very high. But once again, even if we take all those numbers together, it adds up to over $250 billion, unless those economic costs have clear political effects and lead to political pressure on the Russian government in this case, then it's not highly likely to be useful. Which leads me to the next point, which is the question, does it actually work? So it is used highly extensively by many countries, but a lot of researchers and professionals are still skeptical about the effectiveness of sanctions. Some plainly argue that it does not work. And one of the problems here is when the target government has the option to actually adapt to the situation and find new trade partners. As an example, this is the information regarding the extent of trade in oil, in crude oil, between Iran and several other countries before the one of the last level of series of sanctions against Iran a couple of years ago. And as you can see, after the sanctions were imposed, the extent of trade with China and India actually grew. So while Iran may have lost some of its trade partners in Europe or in Japan and Korea, they were able to relatively easily, I don't want to say easily, but they were able to compensate that with more trade with China and India. And by having this enough compensation with other countries, it can offset the economic cost and therefore prevent from those economic sanctions to lead to have any kind of political effect, which is the bottom line of this economic sanctions. So one way we can view the policy of sanctions is as a tool, as a bargaining tool between actors in a strategic interaction, in which each side of this interaction behaves in a rational sense and engages in a cost-benefit analysis of the situation. So every side of this interaction, the sender state, the ones that imposes the sanctions, and the target states, both of them engage in a cost-benefit rational analysis of the situations, and they will decide how to behave. Now, one of the differences when we think about sanctions from a strategic interaction standpoint, this is very different from war, because sanctions will end when one side decides to end it, whether it is the target state or the sender state. They can make the choice, a different choice, that's going to lead to end the sanctions. But in wars, this is a little bit different because both actors have to actually accept that. That's one difference. Now, the sanctions are going to end not because of the economic pressure itself. They will end because of the choice to alter behavior. That can be a choice by the target, which gives up and changes its policy, or the sender, the one that imposes the sanction, relents, and then sanctions end. It usually happens after some time has passes, and one side of these strategic interactions will come to the realization that it's better to settle the situation than continue accumulate the different costs of the economic disputes. Again, the side that decides to settle doesn't have to be the sender, or it doesn't have to be the sender in this case. It can be either the sender or the target. One of them will prefer. It engages in a rational cost-benefit analysis of the situation, and it comes to the realization that it's better off to settle the matter than to keep accumulating those costs. Now I want to move the discussion a little bit forward, talk about the different elements that can shape the success or failures of a sanctions policy by focusing mostly on domestic factors, domestic institutions. We can look at the internal political dynamics in either the sender or the target state and focus on the extent of support for the leader. In this case, I want to talk about the leader in the target state in order to understand how likely it is that a policy of sanctions is going to be successful or not. To do that, we're going to rely on selectorate theory. I've already mentioned that theory once or twice, but now we'll talk about it a little bit more in details. Selection theory is mostly based on the assumptions that leaders, their number one priority is to survive in office. They want to keep their job more than anything else that they want to do, which is a very rational and a very a logical kind of objective they should have. Therefore, leaders will try to secure their positions by providing different benefits to members of their what's called the electorate. And this is another important concept within selectorate theory. It's called the electorate. The electorate is all members of the public that can cast their vote, if we think about it from democratic context, cast their vote and support the leader or not support the leader. Now, leaders do not have to provide the benefits to all the members of their electorate, just to a group which is more likely to secure the role. And this is the winning coalition. So these are the two concepts you should mostly remember when thinking about selectorate theory. The electorate, which is all members of the public, which can vote yes or no, or the winning coalition, this part of the electorate which are needed by the leader to ensure that she or he will be able to survive in office. Again, let's think about it as an example. Let's take the United States as an example. I'll use the United States just to make sure that those concepts are clear, and then we'll go a little bit more to talk about different regimes in different countries. So the electorate in the United States are all the American citizens that can vote and decide whether the president will win the elections in a month and a half or not win the election. This is the electorate. The winning coalition is this part of the American citizens, which if they will vote for the sitting president, he will win the elections and will stay in office. So essentially what selectorate theory is arguing that in order for, again, let's keep with the example that we have here for the United States. In order for Donald Trump to ensure that he's going to stay in office, he has to appease his supporters so they will vote for him and he will stay in office. Now, how do leaders reward their supporters? They can provide them what's called either private good or public goods. Public goods are distributed to all members of the electorate. Private goods are provided to a smaller number of people, the ones who are closer to the leaders, the ones that can, again, they're closer to the leaders and they are important because they're the ones that can ensure that the leaders will survive in office. Again, the example of the United States for those two types of goods is not exactly fitting 100%, but we'll stay with that because it's a simpler way to think about that. A public good for the American population is national security. It doesn't matter if I'm a citizen of the United States. It doesn't matter if I vote for the president or I don't vote for the president or I vote for the opposition. I will still get the same amount of national security as my friend who will vote for the president. At the same time, a private good is, for example, if we stay with the idea of a Republican president, providing tax breaks for the wealthy. Because this is just part of the population that gets benefits from the leadership, and on some level, it's more likely that this part of the population will also support the leadership. So that's an action that the leader is taking in order to ensure its survival in office. Okay, let's think about it now in the context of different regimes. This is one of the main arguments and one of the main aspects that the selectorate theory is trying to explain. How do different regimes behave based on this logic? So democracies usually have large winning coalitions. Now, this is why the example that I talked about so far, the United States, is not 100% one-to-one good examples for that, because the electorate in the United States is very, very big. And even the winning coalition, the number of people that any kind of candidate for the president, whether it's the sitting president at the moment or the challenger, the number of people that they need in order to ensure to win the presidency is very, very large, right? Even if Donald Trump needs only certain amount of people to vote for him, that's still a large amount of people. And the problem in this case is that, let's take to the picture and see that, is that he cannot provide private benefits to all those people. Even the example that I talked about, giving a tax break to the wealthy. There aren't enough wealthy people in the United States to ensure, from a political standpoint, with voting in the elections, that the president is going to win the elections, right? He needs a lot more people than that. And that's the idea of why in the democracies, the winning coalition is very, very large. And in democracies, usually the leaders can only provide public goods and not private goods. On the opposite effect is for autocracies or dictators. And this is where the example comes into play. For dictators, the number of people that they need to please in a way, in order for the leaders to survive, is a lot smaller. So and we have here, of course, Americans voting. And as I said, a lot of people need to vote for the president or for the challenger in order for them to win. The president or the challenger cannot provide private benefits to this number of people because they just don't have the resources. On the other hand, here we have a former Iraqi president, Mr. Saddam Hussein, whose survival in office was mostly dependent upon making sure that he kept the loyalty of his party, which is based actually in the case of Iraq on the family ties of what's called the Ba'ath party, which is based on family ties of a minority of people in Iraq actually. So as long as he kept that small number of people, that can be 10, 20 people in the party, happy from his actions, he will survive in office. Similarly, this is the leadership of the military junta in Argentina in the second half of the 20th century. So that's the idea behind the winning coalition, the difference between a democracy and a non-democracy. In non-democracy, the winning coalition is actually very, very small, whether it is the party, whether it is the leadership in the military leadership, whether it is member of the dictator's family. It's a very small winning coalition. And this is the people that the leader has to satisfy in order to ensure that she or he will remain in power. In democracies, on the other hand, you cannot satisfy all the people that support you with private goods. You need to provide them something which is a lot bigger, and it's a lot harder to ensure that you can survive in office. That's the idea behind the difference between a democracy and a non-democracy, winning coalition and survival in office based on selectorate theory. Okay, so after all these foundations for selectorate theory, let's inject our topic of discussion today of economic sanctions into this debate. So when leaders face sanctions, it doesn't matter now when we talk about what type of leaders, then the pool of resources they have to provide benefits, whether it is private or public, is a lot smaller. And by itself, that serves as a constraint on the leaders. One of the important arguments we can think about is if we are able, as a sender state, to impose sanctions on key supporters of the leaders in the target state, we're more likely to be successful. So again, let's go back to the example of, let's say that the president is dependent on the fact that wealthy people will vote for him. If that was true, if a country wants to impose sanctions on us and they will impose sanctions which will target the wealthy people, then those people will have economic costs because of those sanctions, and they're more likely to put pressure on the president to alter his behavior. So if it's able to create costs for key supporters of the leaders, those sanctions are more likely to be successful. Now let's go back to talk about regimes. So overall, democracies are more sensitive to sanctions because, again, the electorate is bigger and the winning coalition bigger. Leaders cannot provide private benefits in order to secure their positions. And if they will resist the change, if the sanctions create enough cost on the population of democracy, in which leads the population to put pressure on their leader, and if this leader resists the change, he's increasing the risk that it's going to lose the support of his members of his public. And that's exactly what sanctions are intended to do. They're intended to create a political cost based on economic cost. So putting pressure on the public in the United States is supposed to leads to pressure from the public on the president. And if the president is not going to accept the demands from the public, he may lose in the elections and lose his position, which again is the basic assumption of this entire model, which talks about survival in office. And this is what's called the deprivation effect. Sanctions that create deprivation effect on the public, which in turn will shift and change those and turn those economic costs into political pressure on the leaders. Now, at the same time, sanctions that are placed and are being held for a very long time may lead to actually in the opposite effect, which is what's called the backlash effect. The public may first suffer the consequences of sanctions, oppose the way that the government behaves, but then after some time has passed, it may actually lead to the opposite, and the public will begin support the leadership. Why? Because after time has passed and we're facing very adverse conditions, we actually tend to come together. This is based on a lot of psychological literature that I talked about when I talked about the political psychology aspect. We tend to come together and oppose the external pressure that we're facing. So again, let's take as an example here. If we are here living in the United States, and now some country, let's say Canada as an example, decided to impose sanctions on the United States. At first, we're suffering from that, some kind of economic cost, and we are opposing the way that the president behaves and does not change its behavior in order for the sanctions to be removed. But after time has passed and nothing has happened, we're starting to think about that everything that's happened here, that we are being targeted by the Canadian sanctions, and nothing comes into nothing positive comes out of it. So instead of it, we tend to rally around together as the people that live here in the United States, support the president and say, now all of us are fighting against these sanctions by Canada. this is what's called the backlash effect, which is based on the rally around the flag effect. So the support, instead of opposing the leader who does not want to change its policy that led to the sanctions, the public actually will support the leader, which overall reduces the likelihood that the sanctions are going to work. This is just one example for that. The idea of the rally around the flag effect is also very prevalent when you go to talk about international conflict. When the United States engages in some kind of military conflict, usually, especially in the short term after the beginning of the conflict, there's a lot of support for the United States military and the government and the president, because everybody are rallying around the objectives that are we intend to pursue in this conflict. But after a while, usually in the conflict situations, this effect tends to wane down. But it's a similar type of idea how sanctions can actually lead to the opposite effect of a backlash effect. Instead of creating pressure on the public, it's going to turn that pressure to resist the way that the government behaves. The sanctions actually lead the public to come together, to rally behind the president and increase the opposition of the country to the policy of sanctions. Now, when we think about it for dictators or autocrats, their reward structure for their supporter is very, very different than democracy. And that provides them a lot more relative political power facing sanctions. Dictators depend on the much smaller coalition, as I gave you the example of Iraq and Argentina. Therefore, it's easier for those leaders, to protect their supporters in that small coalition when facing economic sanctions. So when sanctions create more scarcity in the resources, then the leaders of those dictatorships will just use their already existing resources for themselves and to provide benefits for their supporters, which means that for the rest of the population, nothing is going to be left. If there was some money in the state's accounts, if you want to call that, whatever is left after the economic sanction is going to the leader and to the small circle of his or her supporters. Nothing else is going to go to the population. Those leaders are also more likely to encourage the creation of black markets and systems of corruptions, which will generate revenue for the leaders despite having the sanctions, making them stronger internally, and as a result, also stronger externally. And overall, the bottom line is the ones who suffer the most from those sanctions, when they are levied against dictators in those kinds of countries, the public is the ones who's most likely to suffer from that. Okay. Failure of sanctions. Okay, so overall, some research I've already suggested, and I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes also. Democracies are more sensitive because of the larger winning coalition, the fact that the leader cannot satisfy everyone, the leader has to be more open to the pressure from the public, so any kind of economic cost imposed on the public are more likely to lead to a change in policy. So economic sanctions should be more successful against democracies. However, when these democracies shows clear and strong resistance to the policy of sanctions, then failure is more likely. Democracies promote transparency, free media, and also free expression for the oppositions. So when all those elements of democracy come together and create this united front against sanctions, then it's highly unlikely that the government will concede and will actually change its policy. So if the president and the government oppose some kind of sanctions that are imposed on us, and now members of the public are also making those kinds of proclamations, and part of the media are transmitting those kinds of message, and then even part of the opposition. So even if we take the existing government here in the United States, so the president, the Republican leadership are opposing the sanctions, and now leadership of the Democrats in the House, in the Senate, wherever that may be, also joining this front against sanctions on the United States, then it makes it highly unlikely that the government will concede and will accept a change in its policy in exchange for removal of the sanctions. So democracies are more sensitive to sanctions, but there are a certain set of conditions which may lead to the fact that failure is actually more likely. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of applications of the sanctions policies in research. So one of the studies that you had for today was the work by Ellen. She presented the logic of sanctions and tested potential conditions for their success or failure. Mostly she relied on what's called survival analysis, which looks at the duration of imposing sanctions, how likely they are to be successful or actually to fail. She looks at the effects of both domestic condition as well as the type of policy which are implemented. And some of the findings that she shows is what you have here on your screen. So when sanctions are more comprehensive, they're more likely to be successful. If sanctions are imposed by multilateral actors, so the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany are operating together to impose sanctions on Iran, they are less likely to be successful because it's harder to sustain that cooperation between all those different actors which have different motivations. It's possible that after some time in which sanctions are imposed on Iran, now France is facing an economic recession, so they want to actually increase their trade with Iran in order to compensate for some of those losses. So that's part problem for the sanctions. It could be that there's a new prime minister in Great Britain, and this prime minister is less supportive of the global economic sanctions against Iran. That leads to difficulties to sustain this policy of multilateral sanctions by multiple actors. Regime, as we said, is critical. She also finds that democracies tend to concede more. She also shows that prolonged sanctions against democracies usually fail. One example that is being talked is the fact that Spain has imposed sanctions over England for over 30 years, since the middle 1950s and the 1980s, when the topics of disputes was the English control over Gibraltar, but it didn't really make any much of a difference. Finally, turnover and change in leadership in the sender state increase the likelihood that sanctions will fail. If the new president, the new prime minister is not that supportive of the sanctions policy, it's actually more likely to fail once we change leadership. So that's Ellen's paper. I want to move now to talk about the citizens in the targeted state. So this is a study by Grossman, who is a professor in the University of Pennsylvania, with a couple of other scholars. And they focused on how do citizens in the state targeted by sanctions, how do they view those matters? So the question here is, does all the logic of the economic sanctions, the theory of economic sanctions that I talked about so far, so putting those economic costs that's going to translate to political pressure on the government, does all this mechanism actually work in the way that the citizens view it? So they're focusing on a democratic state, which is Israel in this case, and how its citizens view different sanctions which were imposed by the EU over the last 10 years, even less. Their study focused on one of the types of sanctions, which is described as a more smart design of sanctions. These are sanctions which are focusing on specific groups that benefit from the policy that the government is implementing and the sender state is opposing. And the idea behind that is that to focus the economic cost on this specific group and minimize the devastating effect on the entire population. This is what's called the distributional effect. So that's only part of the population will suffer economic cost because of the government, which leads to the fact that some other states have decided to impose sanctions on it. And what they do is they use individual level data to explore public attitudes and political consequences of a sanctions policy. So they conduct two different tests. It's not completely different, but two types of tests. The first is they collect survey data in Israel following the 2015 EU decision to label products from the West Bank and the Golan Heights. So this is exactly the form of sanctions which targets specific aspect of a policy. So they're focusing on products that are being manufactured in the territories in the West Bank and the Golan Heights. And so it's intended to target specifically the manufacturers of those products in those areas which are supported by the government policy, and it's not intended to harm the entire Israeli population. So any kind of product which is being manufactured in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or any other place in Israel is not being part of this sanctions policy. It's just those specific products. As you can see on those kinds of products here, and this is dates, And it says here, right here, grown in West Bank Israeli settlement. And that's the idea behind that. Again, the idea behind focusing specifically on those kinds of projects is to put pressure and to create economic cost to the manufacturers of these products, which all of them reside or work in those territories, and they're supposed to pressure the government to change its policy. The main benefits of this kind of test is that it relates to a real-world salient event. It reflects the actual attitudes of the public regarding policy which actually took place. The cost, as I talked about when I talked a little bit about, again, the political psychology and using individual level measures, is the difficulties to generalize the results, because we're talking about a very targeted, very limited sanction, which is employed by a very specific standard. So to compensate for this very specificity of their test, they're also running a lab experiment, which allows them to test more variations of the different sanction options. So for example, in the lab, they also test for different types of sanctions. So whether the sanction is material or symbolic. They also test whether it's a targeted one, just like you had here for the survey, compared to more comprehensive ones. So an academic boycott is a very targeted type of sanction, but it is non-material. On the other hand, sanctions which focus on a lot of Israeli products are both comprehensive, but they're also material. So they should have different effects, and they should have different effects on the attitudes of the public, which suffer the cost of those sanctions. The other thing that they changed in the lab experience, that they manipulated in the lab experience, is talking about the identity of the sender, whether it is a unilateral sanction policy or a multilateral one, and whether those countries that impose the sanctions are supportive of Israel or critical. So the EU is a critical country which imposes sanctions. The United States is actually a supportive one. So having those kinds of elements within the experimental design allows them to test for differences in the types of sanctions that are imposed, and whether those kind of different aspects leads to different opinions of the public. I'll show you some of the results. Some of them are actually pretty interesting. So this is the results based on the experiment, the second part that I talked about. The different colors represent whether they talk about the full sample of participants or just based on different parties and preferences of those samples. But what they measure here is how does being exposed to those different types of sanctions affect the public attitudes regarding different policies. And this figure shows what's called the marginal effect. So first of all, we have to make sure that the different markers here do not cross the zero line, because if they cross the zero line, then the effect is not significant from a statistical standpoint. And every effect that is negative means that the effect here, every marker, which is on the negative side of the zero, represents a negative effect. So let's try and translate some of those findings. What they show here, let's focus on this red marker here, which is on the support settlement freeze. So reading about different sanctions levied by different actors on the Israeli economy has a negative effect on the extent of support of the entire people that participated in this experiment on the policy of supporting settlement freeze. So the effect from, again, going back to the economic principles of economic sanctions, is the exact opposite. Instead of leading the public, creating those economic costs on the public and leading the public to put pressure on the government to freeze the settlements, which was the idea behind those specific sanctions that they talk about, then it has the opposite effect. This is also prevalent, for example, here for the part of the respondents which are fitting with the center political orientations. Also about whether by levying sanctions on Israel, you can actually push the Israeli government to resume negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. And as you can see here, for almost all parts of the sample, the effect is negative. So sanctions does not lead the population to push the government towards resuming negotiation with the Palestinian Authority, but exactly the opposite. Support for the government here is relatively negative, although in most cases it's not really significant, but actually the finding here is that the negative effect on support for the government is not because they are opposing the fact that the government does not freeze settlements or go back to negotiation level, but exactly the opposite, because the public expects the government to actually adopt a more hawkish view and to oppose directly those sanctions. So that's why there is some drop in the approval rating of the prime minister in this case. Now, for the survey, we see here also, again, we have to look at where the markers do not cross the zero line. And we see here different types of senders. The colors represent different types of senders, whether it is the EU or the US or the Quartet. And it's very, very small, so I don't know if you can see, but this is different types of sanctions. And for example, what we see here, when sanctions are imposed by the United States on Israeli goods, then the effect is actually positive, which means it's more likely that the public is gonna view the need to change the policy because the sanctions actually work. So positive effect means the sanctions work. Also, when they are levied by the Quartet against Israeli goods, the members of the left are more supportive of the change in policy. But overall, as you can see from those findings, there's not much effect depending upon the type of sanctions as well as the sender. Also, looking at here, this is also different types of sanctions. And the sender in this case, if we look at the full sample here on the left-hand side, we see, again, the green ones represent Israeli goods. When the United States imposes sanctions on Israeli goods, it's more likely to be positive effect on the change in policy. So the public will pressure the government to change its policy. Similarly, here we find with the more subsamples of the center-oriented from a political standpoint or the left-oriented. So this is just some of the findings. One of the important implications that we can draw out of that research is that it casts serious doubt about the utility of a very limited type, symbolic types of sanctions. Unless the sanctions are comprehensive, then they're less likely to be effective. Here in the survey, the sanctions were focusing on a very specific part of the Israeli economy. And as you can see, across most of them, the effect was almost non-existent. Okay, I want to shift now to the second part of the economic policy tools that I'm going to talk about today, and that is foreign aid. So foreign aid is the contribution of money, goods, and services to other governments, to other people, to other communities in foreign countries, of course. This type of aid is usually given for free or as a heavily subsidized loans or in a price which is well below market value. That's the idea behind foreign aid. The actors which provide aid are usually either governments or NGOs, such as the Red Cross. Aid can be not necessarily just a money support. The services that Doctors Without Borders provide is a type of foreign aid, and various charities which also provide aid. The main objective that aid represents is a trade-off. The recipient country will accept this money or services, whatever the aid consists of, and in exchange, it's going to change its existing policy that the country which provides the aid does not accept. That's the idea behind that. And after changing the policy and accepting the aid, whether it is in money or in goods or in services, then the recipient country can transfer this aid to her resources base. That's the idea behind foreign aid. So the United States would like to provide financial aid to some country in, let's say, Africa. In exchange, that country has to alter a certain policy or certain sets of policies the United States wanted to change. And once the country changes the policy and gets the aid, then this country can transfer the aid to the members of its public. Sounds simple, right? But it's not like that, as you can probably guess. Some of the problems. Overall, aid programs have showed a pretty substantial failure to alleviate poverty or to promote economic, social, and political equalities. They do not lead to the spread of freedom of justice. And one of the main reasons or the main problems that are leading to that is that aid is usually given to dictators or leaders of dictatorships, which steal most of this money and offer very little towards the advanced or the improvement of the lives of their citizens. And one problem that also research has talked about is that while intuitively we should think about foreign aid as a humanitarian types of policy, in many cases there's a lot of other incentives to why countries provide aid to some recipient countries. So one of them can be the spread of ideology. or preventing the spread of ideology. For example, the United States providing foreign aid to countries in Africa in order for those countries not to support the communist ideology during the Cold War. Whether it is to strengthen trade relations, so China will provide foreign aid to countries in the Middle East in order to have stronger relations with them and then have more trade among them. So that provides also benefits for China. Lastly, the United States has provided a lot of foreign aid, especially financial one, to some countries in South Africa, in order to in South America, I'm sorry, in order to ensure that the leaders that they had in place that the Americans preferred will actually keep their position. Okay. Now, foreign aid, we should view that in terms of why would the country provide foreign aid, or why would the country would like to accept foreign aid. Thinking about it from the context, again, of a leader who accepts foreign aid is mostly focusing on using that aid to secure her own political survival and not necessarily to improve the conditions in which the population lives under. That already places a very problematic restriction on the normative angle of why we want to provide aid. Allegedly, we want to provide aid, to improve the living conditions of the populations. But in many cases, those leaders that get this aid actually use that for their own benefits to secure their own survival. We're going to talk about this a little bit also in the context of selectorate theory. I remind you again, even though I talked about it about 20 minutes ago, what selectorate theory talks about. So the most important thing for the leader is to survive in office. That leader provides benefits to its supporters in order to survive in office. And the most important part of the population that the leader has to satisfy is its winning coalition. The differences between democracies, which usually have larger winning coalitions, while leaders of autocracies or dictatorships have much smaller coalitions. So essentially, in a democracy, there's a lot more people you have to please in order to secure their position. Okay, so that's, again, selectorate theory. And again, we want to talk about aid in that context. So when leaders receive aid, they will usually distribute this aid to their coalition of supporters, but in exchange, those members of the coalition will have to adopt a policy that they don't necessarily like. So, or maybe they have to, the leader has to change a policy that members of the coalition preferred, but because aid was given to the leader in exchange for changing the policy, then those members of the coalition will have to accept the fact that the policy is going to change, and it's unlike, and it's the opposition to what they prefer. So let's focus now on dictators. What happens when dictators are the ones who receive the aid? The leaders who are having to satisfy a very small coalition, dictators, will usually take this aid, distributed most of this extra resources to their own coalition, which means that most citizens will get nothing. So those extra resources, because of the aid, are going to be given to members of the winning coalition of the leader, which is a small number of people in dictatorships, and the citizens will get nothing in exchange. So overall, when we think about foreign aid, the logic is pretty similar to the logic of economic sanctions that I talked about 20, 25 minutes ago. Only this time, the pool of resources for the dictator actually increases. When we talked about economic sanctions, I mentioned that the pool of resources decreases, and from whatever is left, all the money is going to go to the leader and her base of support. Similarly, even when those kinds of leaders get more money because of foreign aid, then this pool of resources increases. It does not mean it's going to use this extra money to provide it to the public. Exactly the opposite. It's going to use more money to itself and more money to this winning coalition of the leader to ensure he's appeasing them by providing them more funds, and therefore he's more likely to secure his own position. So in these conditions, the public actually suffers a loss which is double. First, they have to accept the ramification of the policy that they disliked, whether this is a policy that their own government implemented, that they had to change the policy because this was a condition to accept the aid, so they have to accept that. And in addition, they don't get any material benefits or compensation from the fact that aid was given and they had to accept a policy that they don't like. So the cost for the public is even bigger. Now, we can think about how those kinds of policies and how those kinds of outcomes lead to different views of the sender state within how the donor state is viewed within the public of the target state. So how do citizens in the recipient countries will view the donor states? Because that aid is mostly used to encourage more corruption and support the survival of their regime, then actually the members of the recipient countries will have a very negative view of the donor, because in their minds, the donor state only provides money that is given to a corrupt regime and help it survive. In addition, we can also think about what are the benefits from providing aid. So if we are now here in the United States, we want to provide aid to some country in Africa, why do we do that? What are the benefits that we get out of it? It is not clear whether the change in policy, my example from earlier was that Rwanda would change its policy, and in exchange, the United States provides its foreign aid. Does the change in policy of Rwanda actually matters for the welfare and the livelihood of the American population? Not clear. A more specific example from during the Cold War, the United States provided foreign aid to Uganda in exchange for that country's rejection of communism. It is not very clear how does the rejection of communism by Uganda has helped the American public. We're not sure about that. Another example is the extensive foreign aid that the United States provides to Egypt. So since the signing of the Camp David agreements and the peace accords between Israel and Egypt in the end of the late 1970s, the United States has provided a substantial amount of aid to Egypt. And one of the main objectives was to provide a lot of incentives for the Egyptian government to maintain the recognition of Israel and essentially to stick with the peace agreement. However, most of the Egyptian citizens do not really support this kind of policy because the government have used that foreign aid money to its own benefit and did not make any effort to provide some benefits for the citizens for their accepting the policy that included overall the peace agreement with Israel. So there was no investment by the Egyptian government in education, which supports overall which is intended overall to provide benefits in terms of more people will understand why the agreement is existing and they should support that. Instead, most of the money was mostly intended to secure the survival of the leaders, and that led to a substantial public opposition. Now, this kind of aid increases the likelihood that those in power will remain so, and they will actually keep pursuing such policies because that ensures their survival and they offer very little to the population. The last thing I want to talk about is an application of the aid policy tool, focusing on the context of actually conflict issues. So this is the work by Sexton from a couple of years ago, and he asked the question overall, can aid reduce the cost in a civil war? The idea is to employ the logic of foreign aid as a policy tool in civil war, and the objective behind using foreign aid is to strengthen the government, allow it to establish control over areas which are in question, and win the public support in a civil war context. Now, he raises, the author raises a very important issue. Is it possible that foreign aid will actually lead to an increase in violence? The logic for that is we have to think about the strategic calculations of participants in a civil conflict and their incentives to actually derail the potential benefits of aid. Mostly his focus, the focus is on insurgents that they respond to this distribution of aid in a way that's supposed to mitigate the potential benefits for the government. So insurgents are countering the aid that's going into the government in different types of actions that are intended to undermine the position of the government in the conflict and to support their own position in the conflict. So he tested his theory in Afghanistan, focusing on contested areas, which are areas where the government is not in full control. The time is different. The extent of violent incidents between 2008 and 2010, he uses what's called geolocation data. So looking more specifically at the geography of Afghanistan and different types of data, different types of areas and where there is conflict and more or not. The variation between contested territories and non-contested territories is very, very important because it helps the author to establish the causal effects of civilian aid programs in the fight against the Taliban is, again, part of the civil war. Before getting into the final results that we're going to finish with today, I'll stop for today's attendance word. So attendance word for today is Aggies. Aggies is the attendance word for today. All right, so what does the research finds? It finds that aid that is distributed in contested areas lead to actually an increase in violence. So just the way that the logic was described, as I talked about a couple of minutes ago, rebels or insurgents are opposing the distribution of aid by increasing their actions against the government in those contested areas. At the same time, aid was more useful in areas where the government already had control with the help of the Americans in this case, and that actually led to a decrease in violence. The third finding is that the type of aid program matters. So humanitarian type of aid have no effect. On the other hand, defense kind of projects, foreign aid in the form of defense projects, tends to increase the degree of violence. Whether those kinds of projects are implemented in contested territories or territories which are controlled by the Afghan government did not really matter. Once the projects were focusing on defense, then the degree of violence tended to increase. So some of the implications for this research, the idea behind using the policy tool of economic aid in order to affect conflict behavior is that by itself, aid cannot win public support. It mostly serves the role of a force multiplier in areas where the government already has control, helps to pacify this area, so there's less violence in those areas that the government already has control, foreign aid supports that. But at the same time, it does not provide incentives for the government to engage in any kind of actions that's going to reduce the extent of violence against the rebels. It leads to the exact opposite effect. The attacks are actually mostly initiated by the insurgents and not the government. That's the negative effect that aid has in this kind of context. Okay, so that finishes the discussion for today. There's a few more studies here if you're interested. Economic sanctions and trade policy. This is a work from Professor Pond, which was one of the professors here in our department, and a few other studies if you're interested in. I'll remind you once again that the deadline for your midterm task is Friday night at midnight. If you have any more questions over the last minute, you can still come to office hours if you have still time while you watch this lecture, or send me an email and I can try and help you. And that's it. Have a lovely weekend. And with Cody here in the background, I'll tell you goodbye.